Hello everyone, my name is John. Welcome back to the channel. Now, we talk a lot on this channel about the government entities that write our dietary guidelines, those who are responsible for writing the rules and regulations that large food manufacturers are to follow. And these rules are supposed to be designed to protect our health, the public's health. That's what's in mind when these rules are written, because some of the food that's being produced and put on the shelves in our grocery store have chemicals in them that are not good for our health, that are harmful to our health, that are cancer causing to our health. So these rules are designed to protect us. And so what these large manufacturers has figured out is that we're making billions and billions of dollars selling these products to the public. It is in our best interest, for our profits' sake, to take some of those profits and pay these government entities to relax the rules, to let some of these chemicals that we are putting in our food products go by. And in the end of the day, guess who suffers? It's us. It's the public. It's the people who are consuming these products. Today is no different. It is a major, major problem, especially when you get into the hundreds of conflicts of interest. And we're going to keep on exposing it. We're going to keep bringing it to the light. So let's get into it. In 2020, Dr. Sharon Donovan helped write the official nutrition guidelines that tell 330 million Americans what to eat every single day. Over the previous 5 years, she also maintained 152 separate financial relationships with food and pharmaceutical companies. That breaks down to one new industry conflict every 12 days, and she wasn't alone. 19 out of the 20 experts on the 2020 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee had financial ties to the exact industries their recommendations would affect. Here's the question nobody at the USDA wanted to answer. When the scientists writing America's nutrition policy are simultaneously getting paid by cereal companies, dairy associations, and pharmaceutical firms, whose interests are they really serving? Every 5 years, the U.S. Departments of Agriculture and Health and Human Services release the dietary guidelines for Americans. These aren't suggestions. Federal law requires these guidelines to form the foundation for every federal nutrition program in the country. That includes SNAP benefits, WIC programs, and meal standards for every public school. We're talking about more than $100 billion in annual federal nutrition spending shaped by recommendations from this committee. The government will tell you these conflicts were disclosed and reviewed by ethics officials. That's technically true. What they won't tell you is that after being disclosed, these conflicts were essentially ignored. The disclosure forms that were supposed to be posted publicly never appeared. Researchers who tried to access them in 2021 couldn't find them anywhere. Dr. Donovan's 152 industry relationships weren't casual consulting gigs. Research grants from Nestlé, consulting fees from Abbott Nutrition, speaking honoraria from dairy industry groups, advisory board positions with pharmaceutical companies. And she wasn't an outlier. Researchers publishing in the journal Public Health Nutrition in 2022 documented that 95% of committee members had direct financial relationships with the industries whose products they were evaluating. Leading nutrition researchers are often leading precisely because industry funding allowed them to conduct large studies and publish extensively. The more qualified you are to serve on this committee, the more likely you've already developed financial relationships with the companies whose products you'll be evaluating. It's a circular system where independence and expertise have become mutually exclusive. In 2017, the National Academies of Sciences published a congressionally mandated report with explicit recommendations: enhance transparency, manage conflicts of interest, and publicly post disclosure forms. The 2020 committee ignored those recommendations. The conflicts were filed with ethics officials and then effectively buried. The 2020 dietary guidelines included recommendations for infants and toddlers for the first time in history. The Pregnancy and Lactation Subcommittee had 6 members. 4 of them had financial relationships with manufacturers of infant formula and breast milk substitutes. Dr. Donovan had ties to Mead Johnson, Wyeth, and Abbott. The Birth to 24 Months Subcommittee showed the same pattern. 4 out of 6 members had industry connections to formula manufacturers. When 2/3 of the committee writing America's first ever infant feeding guidelines has financial ties to formula manufacturers, you have to ask, are these guidelines reflecting the best science or the best science that doesn't threaten formula sales? The World Health Organization recommends exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months. The 2020 guidelines were notably softer on that recommendation. Dr. Robert Kushner's situation illustrates how these conflicts create problematic incentives. While serving on the committee, he was simultaneously consulting for Weight Watchers, Novo Nordisk, and Eli Lilly. These are companies that profit from obesity and diabetes treatments. Kushner was evaluating evidence about foods that contribute to obesity and diabetes, while receiving paychecks from companies that make billions treating those exact conditions. In 2020, the government, for the first time in history, issued nutritional guidelines for toddlers and infants. Now, you would think that this panel would be beyond reproach. Instead, 4 out of 6 members on the Lactation and Pregnancy Committees had direct ties to the infant formula manufacturers. When 2/3 of the committee that's writing the rules for babies' nutrition is getting checks from companies like Mead Johnson and Wyeth, it's no surprise that the final recommendations on breastfeeding were notably softer. They aren't just writing the guides, they're protecting a market, and in return, they're getting paid handsomely to do so. Does this mean he deliberately wrote recommendations to make people sick? Almost certainly not. Does it mean his interpretation of ambiguous evidence might unconsciously favor conclusions that don't threaten his consulting clients' business models? That's exactly what conflict of interest research shows happens, even when experts genuinely believe they're being objective. The most frustrating part is how this affects the 30 million American children who eat school meals every day. The 2020 dietary guidelines that shaped those meal standards came from a committee where 95% of members had industry financial ties. Those school meals emphasize processed grains, low-fat dairy, and industrial foods. Are these recommendations based on the strongest available science about child nutrition, or are they based on science filtered through researchers whose careers depend on maintaining good relationships with food companies? When you're interpreting contradictory evidence about whether low-fat dairy is healthier than full-fat dairy, and you've received funding from dairy industry groups that promote low-fat products, which interpretation are you more likely to find convincing? The 2020 guidelines continued recommending processed grain consumption, industrial seed oils, and low-fat dairy products. These recommendations benefit the companies that paid committee members. They also happen to be the dietary pattern that's dominated American nutrition advice for decades. While obesity rates tripled, diabetes increased 7-fold, and chronic diseases came to affect the majority of adults. The International Life Sciences Institute had connections to 11 different committee members. ILC is funded by Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, Nestlé, McDonald's, and dozens of other food industry giants. When 11 out of 20 dietary guideline authors have ties to an organization funded by the companies whose products they're evaluating, can those guidelines truly be called independent? Here's what makes this a systemic problem. The government appoints qualified experts, but the system of research funding has ensured that the most qualified experts are usually those who've received the most industry funding. Academia doesn't pay for large nutrition studies. Industry does. So by the time you're qualified enough to serve on this committee, you've probably already developed the financial relationships that compromise your independence. The solution is to recognize that financial conflicts create bias even in well-intentioned people, and to implement the transparency strategies that the National Academies recommended in 2017. Post the disclosure forms publicly, limit the percentage of committee members with industry ties, require recusal from discussions affecting funding sources. These are standard practices in clinical medicine. The good news is that you don't have to wait for the system to fix itself. When nutrition advice comes from scientists with extensive industry ties, that advice deserves skepticism. The foods that sustained human health for millennia remain available. Quality meats, natural fats, vegetables. Every time you choose real food over processed products promoted by guidelines written by industry-connected scientists, you're making a decision based on traditional wisdom rather than conflicted expertise. Dr. Sharon Donovan had 152 financial relationships with food and pharmaceutical companies while writing dietary guidelines that determine what your children eat at school. Those conflicts were disclosed disclosed and then effectively hidden from public view. 19 out of 20 committee members had similar conflicts. The National Academies recommended transparency in 2017. The 2020 committee ignored those recommendations. This isn't about assuming malicious intent. This is about recognizing that financial relationships bias scientific interpretation and that Americans deserve to know when the people writing their nutrition guidelines are getting paid by the industries those guidelines affect. When 95% of committee members have industry financial ties, the guidelines deserve skepticism, not blind trust. So there you have it. I hope you like this video. I'm going to ask you a small favor. Click that notification bell and like the video and subscribe to my channel so that we can continue to provide this type of content for you. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next video. Bye for now.